My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today is returning guest Matthew Hoh. He's an ex-Marine Corps company commander in Iraq. He is an ex-political officer for the US State Department in Afghanistan, and he famously resigned in 2009 in protest to Obama's surge in Afghanistan. And I'm very pleased to have him here again to talk about Iraq. How are you doing, Matt?
Good, Louis. Thanks for having me back on with you.
No problem. So if you could just take our minds back to 2002, 2003, of when there's a lot of discussion of making the Iraq war happen. What were the White House and people around that stated reasons for invading Iraq, and just how fraudulent were they?
Oh, they were incredibly fraudulent, and it was a masterful deceit. It was very well done, their execution of getting the war they wanted. This is something that blocks of the American foreign policy community have wanted for quite a long time. I think it's important to go back. One of the things I've been talking about this week, Chris Hedges reminded me of this in one of his writings. The United States was sending weapons into Iraq, the Nixon administration, in 1972. They did this for about 3 years, trying to arm the Kurds to cause instability and basically a coup, a revolution, if you will, in Iraq. You know, of course, in 1980, you had the Iran-Iraq War, which went on for 8 years, at least 1 million people killed, entire cities destroyed. That was an American proxy war. Then you had the first Iraq War, 1990, 1991. Then you had the sanctions all throughout the 90s up through 2003. And then you had the, in addition to that, coupled with the sanctions, which sanctions were so cruel and horrendous, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died because of them. That's not hyperbole or exaggeration. That's the reality of it. But alongside those sanctions, throughout that period, through the Clinton administration, up through the first couple of years of the Bush administration, the United States was bombing Iraq every third day. You know, dropped tons and tons of bombs on Iraq throughout that period. So by the time you get to 2003, the United States has been in the process of using violence to destroy Iraq politically, you know, and of course, devastating society, killing millions of people, you know, just wrecking it for 30 years at least. So, I mean, that's kind of the I think the perspective we need to keep as we remember 20 years ago, the attitudes and who was behind this and why they wanted it. This was an American foreign policy goal, control of Iraq through one shape or another, either through proxy leadership or overthrowing that and putting someone else into place. You know, this idea of using sectarian differences, using Kurds against Arabs, Shia against Sunni. This was something that had long been in play. This is a hallmark. You know, I like to say this divide and conquer strategy is something we Americans got from you Brits, right? I mean, you all were very good with that, with your British Empire in terms of how you conquered people. And I mean, that's just I guess if you're going to do colonial conquest and imperialism, divide and conquer is a pretty good way to go about it, because I think most empires have done that. So, I mean, what they did was they recognized the opportunity of 9/11. They recognized that 9/11 was their access to getting the war that they wanted in Iraq. And we see this. We see this, I can't recall off the top of my head now, right now, if it was the day of the 9/11 attacks or the day after. But Don Rumsfeld is saying to Steve Cambone, who's a very senior member of the Defense Department, get me everything you have on Iraq. We're going to tie them into this. Bush says to his counterterrorism czar, Richard Clark, Clark says this in his memoirs, that, within a couple of weeks of the attacks, Bush is beating on Clark. You got to show me how this ties into Iraq. How is Saddam connected? And, Richard Clark is, Mr. President, this is what are you talking about? Al-Qaeda's got nothing to do with Saddam Hussein in the Ba'athist government in Iraq. These guys they're polar opposite. They're mortal enemies, and no, I mean, so you had all that. Plus you had the intersection, the connection to the Saudis. You had, and then you had all the again, going back to the foreign policy community of the United States that saw Iraq as key to America's success in the Middle East. And they had a variety of different reasons for it. I wish you could point to one and say this was it, but I think as many different individuals and you're talking a small group of people here, 50 to 100 really, probably, in terms of who was prominent and whose views were being listened to and who had the ability to make decisions and get things in motion. 50 to 100 people maybe total in and out of the government. And then, of course, a whole underlying foundation of sycophants and profiteers and those who go along to get along, and but some of them believe, and I think this is one that hasn't been spoken about nearly enough, that removing Iraq was the key to securing Israel in the region. That if you could remove Iraq, you would take away the Palestinians' biggest benefactor. That would then threaten as well Syria and Iran, and that by bringing that down, you would improve Israel's position with the Palestinians, but then also too overall in the region. You had those who, of course, were interested in it for oil concerns and commerce concerns. You had those who were true believers, who believed that the United States had a mission to democratize and liberate the Middle East. You had others who were so enthralled with the America as the historical champions. We won the Cold War. We are the sole superpower. And how dare anyone thumb their nose at us like Saddam Hussein has done for this past decade, right? So we have to put in place, we have to use our force to show that we deserve this position as the sole superpower, right? I mean, so, and then there are a host of other things. I mean, people really did believe that was the end of history. People really did believe that there was a clash of civilizations. I'm referring to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, and Sam Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations. I mean, so all these things, right? All these things come together in an administration that has the good fortune of the 9/11 attacks to allow them to use that as a reason to push forward with this war. And so going back to what you asked, and it's very long-winded, I know, but their ability to craft a narrative, their ability to tell a story, their ability to use the media, use politics, use whatever they had available to them to get anyone and everyone on board. I mean, they had, in the days before the Iraq invasion, public opinion polls in the U.S., 70% supportive, somewhere close to 80% supportive, if I recall correctly. So they were able to get this war that they wanted by selling it. And, they used fear, they used clumsy, irrational logic, and of course, they deliberately used false intelligence. And show how masterful they are. 20 years later, if you look at most American media, and I can imagine the British media as well, from what I've seen, the explanation for the Iraq War is that it was faulty intelligence, as if these were men and women who meant well, who were really trying to get the right thing done based upon what information was given to them by the intelligence services. And as we know, the intelligence was completely completely manufactured. There are, all kinds of records of what the actual intelligence was. And the actual intelligence said that there was no connection for the Iraqi government and 9/11 attacks, no connection between the Iraqi government and Al Qaeda, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. But that was all either pushed aside, ignored, deliberately misrepresented, however you want to explain it. But 20 years later, they were so good at their storytelling, so masterful at it, right? That is the explanation that you will read or hear in the newspapers and the television for why did this happen? Well, the intelligence was faulty. The intelligence was bad. No, they lied about it. They knew what the intelligence was, and they chose to do this and just made up stuff or cherry picked or whatever to get the war that they wanted.
You've actually answered a couple of questions I planned to there, which is great. But just to confirm, these are knowing lies. These aren't mistakes. Obviously, there's certain people who may have parroted it, who weren't in the know and genuinely believed there was weapons of mass destructions. But the people in the know, who I am going to ask in a couple of questions' time about, obviously, the neocons, but the people pushing it, did they knowingly lie, or did they believe their own lies, or is there actual evidence they knew it was?
I think it was. There's a mix of all that, right? There's the hubris and arrogance that it didn't matter to them. They were convinced of their own superiority. They were convinced of their own righteousness. So Saddam had to go. Iraq had to have an overthrow of the government. We had to reshape and redo Iraq because that was right. And whether or not there's evidence or not, you have people coming into the administration at that point who believed it regardless of what the evidence said. And then they were just wanted to sell a point. They wanted to, Dick Cheney wanted to just sell a war, right? And he'll use whatever he has to use to sell it because they believed what they believed, So, but they did. They created their own special intelligence units that would bypass, because the CIA, the DIA, INR, the State Department weren't giving them the information that they wanted. So they created their own special intelligence units, which then assembled the intelligence that they wanted to prove the point. I think it's a human psychological case here. At what point people who are lying, at what point do they start believing their own lies, right? So I think there's a degree of psychology. But I can also tell you, at senior levels of the government, people were just deceived. So at this point, I get to the Pentagon in 2002. I'm a captain in the Marine Corps. I come from Okinawa, and I go to the Pentagon, and I am I am in the Secretary of the Navy's office. So I'm a junior Marine Corps officer on the Secretary of the Navy's personal staff. So, fly in the wall, small bump on a big log, however you want to describe it. But you see a lot, and you hear a lot, and you certainly read a lot, and you see all the, but my friend was the secretary's aide. And so she went with him to all these briefings, and many times she sat in the briefings with him. And so she saw what was being presented to the Secretary of the Navy, okay, the guy who's in charge of the Navy and the Marine Corps. She saw what he was being told. And I remember Lori, her name was, Lori talking to me after one briefing, and this might have been December or so of 2002, and saying like, wow, they just give a presentation today from the secretary, from Rumsfeld's office, basically, or maybe it was from the Joint Chiefs office, but like, wow, that information, there's no doubt that they have weapons of mass destruction. Right? Because why would you think that you would be purposely lied to? Maybe you should say people should be sharper than that, or more clever than that, or more cynical or skeptical. But if you're the Secretary of the Navy, why would you presume that you were being lied to by your peers, basically, and by your boss? But that's the scale of the deception. So you had, members of Congress, senior government, senior military, who were presented with this information in a way that you would have suspected that it would have been presented differently than what was given to the media. You could say, well, of course, they're going to give the media and the public you know, the kind of they're going to give them the good news version, right? They're going to give them the public relations version. But within the building, within the Pentagon, within the State Department, within Langley, aren't they going to give the actual information? And no, they didn't do that. So I think there's a host of ways that the lies occurred, the lies had life, the lies became, you know, but they did it. You know, one of the things that they did, and they were so callous about it. You remember, these people are sociopaths. So if people recall, one of the reasons, one of the things that got people's emotions up in late 2002, early 2003 was the case of Commander Mike Spiker. Mike Spiker was a Navy pilot who was shot down in the first Iraq War, 1990-1991. So shot down sometime in early 1991. And Pentagon had long since declared him dead. There had been like these supposed sightings of somebody. And what the Pentagon does in 2002, 2003, and this just shows you how depraved they are, is they start putting out these rumors as fact, as intelligence, that Spiker's alive and is being held in captivity in Iraq. So one of the things that occurs is you have this momentum to go get Mike Spiker, to free Mike Spiker. And his family believed it. I mean, they had no compunction. They had no hesitation in letting a grieving family that had, you know, lost their son years before and body had never been returned, probably had made some degree of closure. They had no hesitation just opening that up and using them for their own purposes in pushing this war. And that, of course, is one individual, one family in a tale of millions who are devastated by this, right? But that shows you, I think, who they were, as well as, too, the fact that the media jumped so fully on board that story, as they did with all the other stories. They just would repeat them without any skepticism, without any degree of evidence, without any type of journalistic ethos behind their reporting.
Yeah, obviously the weapons of mass destructions was obviously the big lie, and, you know, Colin Powell, the UN and everything.
Right.
But not a lot of people might not be aware of this. So did Saddam Hussein or Iraq ever have chemical weapons and aspirations towards nuclear weapons? And who provided this and who assisted with this?
Right. So they did. And they used chemical weapons, right? They used it in the Iran-Iraq war. The Iraqis used it against the Iranians. The Iraqis, Saddam's government, the Ba'ath Party, then used it against the Kurds. You know, people are familiar with the town Hawija. That was, people were massacred there with poison gas. The United States knew that Iraq had the chemical weapons. There's some evidence that the manufacture of those weapons were reliant on U.S. and European support, that it couldn't have happened without certain imports. But I don't know if, you know, with that type of stuff, I don't know if you're talking about things that are called dual use. So if you're going to make mustard gas, you don't need anything particular to mustard gas or particular to the military to make mustard gas. You can use it from commercial agricultural products or what have you. So I don't know that, but the Americans did know the Iraqis had them. They did know they used them. They ended up during the Iran-Iraq war giving the Iraqis intelligence about the Iranians so that the Iraqis could better use their chemical weapons against the Iranians. And then when Saddam's government, when the Iraqi government uses those chemical weapons against the Kurds, against civilians, the American government knows this right away, but they blame it on the Iranians. And the American government stands up for the Iraqi government at the United Nations and defends them and says, no, it wasn't, it was the right, you know, so.
Yeah, I was actually reading a few books about the Iran-Iraq war, and there was actually a US document where it talks about how Iran is bringing a resolution to the UN about Iraqi use of chemical weapons. And by this time, you can find many memos the US talk about that they've used it. And this whole US, I think it was State Department document, is about how we're basically going to try and get as many nations, Western nations, to vote against the resolution. If we can't, then we'll vote for it because they don't want to seem like obviously monsters. I think they did vote against it. But the whole bit is like they're aware Iraq's using chemical weapons, and they have a bit about talking points, and it's like, we're not going to blame it on Iraq. We say, we encourage Iraq and Iran not to use chemical weapons and, the Geneva Conventions. But they knew this, and they were just trying to get as many nations to vote against it. But if they couldn't, to save face, then they'd vote for it. It was quite interesting to read.
Right. So the lie is about Iraq didn't start with the George W. Bush administration. It was a proven, had been done before. And they certainly had chemical weapons, and they had a nuclear weapons program. The Israelis attacked their nuclear weapons facility at one point. And they had this, and the Iraqis were very clear about it. It was overt. But then after the 1991 war, the Iraqis destroy those. They don't continue with any type of nuclear program. They destroy their chemical weapons. I don't know if they ever had a biological program or not, but so they did, and they destroyed it. And the Americans knew that. The inspectors had been in. We had defectors. The man who was the head of that program had told our intelligence, we don't have it anymore. We got rid of them all. What would happen though is when we would find old artillery shells with chemical weapons in them that have been forgotten about, misplaced, whatever, and I do remember at the beginning of the invasion, some of those weapons were found and the administration tried to make a big deal out of it. At that point, you had some journalists and media that were saying, wait a minute, this is what? This is not what you were talking about. This is old stuff, and this actually shows that they were destroying everything else because all you have are one or two that somehow, which is always to me was pretty scary how poorly handled the Iraqi chemical weapons were, that they had misplaced these. But that's what happened, And so no, they did have a nuclear program, they did have a chemical program, they had used the chemical weapons. But they had abandoned that and then destroyed those chemical weapons. And so by the time 2003 comes, there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There is nothing that Saddam would threaten his neighbors with. And then all the different things that were just the different the evidence that the Americans would point to about the Iraqis' threats to the region, to Europe, to the United States, were always laughable. In a month or two before the invasion, the Americans were going on about a drone. The Iraqis have a drone that they can attach chemical weapons or biological weapons like anthrax to and fly it, and it would just release it like a crop duster. And the Iraqis said, "You talking about this thing?" And it was like made out of balsa wood. It was just laughable. And that's unfortunately what but that is tragically what almost all the American claims were about whether Iraq's ties to 9/11, their ties to Al-Qaeda, their chemical nuclear weapons programs. Laughable, absolutely laughable, completely devoid of any evidence, manufactured to allow for a war, to sell a war, to give these men and women the war that they wanted. And of course, you had journalists who said, this doesn't add up, this isn't right. Guys like Jonathan Landay at Knight Ridder, a few others, a handful of others, but not many, because once it goes along, once it's moving, the groupthink, the fear of being left out, is the fear that you're not going to have access. One of the things that, again, masterful is how they did this. One of the things that the Pentagon does to ensure journalistic compliance and complicity, besides the ratings and everything else that were so great for the cable news networks, besides the actual access journalism where journalists want to make sure that they're getting interviews with Don Rumsfeld or with General Myers or whoever, you also have what the Pentagon does is this embedding program. And they put hundreds of journalists through boot camps, and they send them to places like Quantico, Virginia, the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, and they put them through military training for a few weeks, and they build up this relationship, and they get them all excited about the war, and then they embed them in the units, and they say, you're going to be with the 82nd Airborne, or you're going to be with, famously you had the Rolling Stone article from the journalist, and I'm blanking on his name, but HBO did that. One of the best things I think about the Iraq War or the Iraq invasion, Generation Kill, which you can find on HBO. So if you're writing negative stories, if you're being skeptical, if you're being a pain in the ass to the Pentagon's public relations people, you're not going to get to go to this journalist boot camp, and you're certainly not going to get embedded with, the 101st Air Assault Division or anything like that. So it was, again, I keep coming back to this word, masterful, but it really was. They did a really great job, heinous as it was. They did a really great job at selling this war.
Just how strong, while we're on the media, just how strong was the media's role in it? And again, was it just, did they fall for their lies? Because now looking from every war that has been sent since, you can't say, oh, they fell for it again, they fell for it again, they fell for it again. But maybe was this different because now it's like, oh, the Iraq war happened, you don't have an excuse. But still, obviously,
well, they were
for the 21st century, for many things, for them not to believe what they're saying. So how strong was the media's voice in cheering this on, and were they duped, or what? It depends on each organization and journalist, I guess.
They were, yeah, it was. I think to give a blanket, you can give a blanket statement in that they were willing co-participants in the march for war. The ratings were great. And you've had plenty of journalists say this. I mean, no less of a media persona than Katie Couric. And if your viewers not familiar with, Katie Couric was the first woman to anchor any evening news as full-time anchor in the United States. She at that point was on NBC's Today Show, which is biggest morning program in the U.S. Katie Couric is a big media person in the U.S. No one less than her said that, it came from the top that we were going to be pro-war. Because of our corporations' relationship to other corporations and how good the war would be across the board, we were pro-war. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I mean, you had many others. And then they fired journalists. They fired people who were not towing the line. Chris Hedges at the New York Times was a war correspondent with them for decades, was their Middle East bureau chief. Was probably one of the best war correspondents of the second half of the 20th century. And they fire him because he disagrees with the war. He's skeptical about it. On MSNBC, they fire Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue, if you're not familiar with U.S. media, Phil Donahue was a daytime talk show host who was incredibly popular. He was Oprah before Oprah was, kind of thing, right? I mean, Phil Donahue gets fired because of his disagreement and skepticism of the Iraq War. And there are the MSNBC documents clearly stating we're firing him because he's making us look bad against the war. Jesse Ventura, who, if people remember Jesse Ventura, the wrestler who became the governor of Minnesota, he was scheduled to become a host on MSNBC before all of this happened, these wars. And they said, will you not speak against the war? And he said, no. And they didn't put him on the air. And they ended up paying him out millions and millions of dollars. MSNBC would rather pay Jesse Ventura millions of dollars for doing nothing than have him be on the air critiquing and, disagreeing with the U.S. war in Iraq. Those are two examples of many. And they went along with it, though, and they saw a good thing. They wanted to be embedded. They didn't want to be left out. The money that their parent companies were making, NBC is owned by General Electric. General Electric's best customer is the Department of Defense, right? I mean, you have all those relationships. You have the journalists who see this as their way to get ahead, right? You want to speak out against the war, you want to express skepticism, well, you can get on the unemployment line with Donahue and Hedges then. Or you can get in line, be with the team, and, be with the Marines as they enter into Iraq. And then you might be, the next Walter Cronkite, or you might be, you're right. You think about the famous journalists from the Vietnam War, or that's how Dan Rather made his name, right? From CBS News in the Vietnam War. And then, of course, you had the journalists like Edward R. Murrow, heading over the skies of Europe in a B-24 bomber or whatever. I mean, you could be that guy. And so very exciting, very enthralling, very romantic to these journalists. So again, you can't point to one thing and say like, this is it. It's everything that comes together. And then that builds an inertia, right? And then the sum is greater than the total of the parts, I mean, so you have something that's just so overwhelming. But yeah, the intoxication, the romanticism of war, and the media had done this in the Balkans campaign. In 1999, when you have the Kosovo air campaign, the air campaign against Serbia, the U.S. media is tripping over themselves to congratulate the Americans and the Clinton administration on this air war that was so precise, and it removed a tyrant and stopped genocide and everything else. All things that untrue. The first Iraq War, 1991 war, the American media was just, that was preparation for this, with how, and particularly too, that was the coming out for cable news. So I remember being a senior in high school, I was 17, 18 years old, and being able to watch the war on CNN. And of course, how well the Pentagon in particular manipulated and enthralled viewers around the world with the high technology precision. Everyone remembers from that Norman Schwarzkopf, the American general, showing the video of the bomb going down like the chimney stack or the air vent of a building, right? How precise it was. And, and of course, that was chosen precisely because that video is chosen precisely because of the final scene of Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker drops the bomb down the air shaft of the Death Star. That was, like, you have all those cultural and societal tie-ins that makes this thing, this inertia, this Leviathan, irresistible to so many.
Yeah, just going to ask you a few more questions, and then we can sort of move to your personal experience and what you was doing. Just to back up a previous point about the Iran-Iraq war, for just people who may not be aware, we backed Saddam Hussein against Iran. We was aware he used chemical weapons. And there are many documents where it talks about how a lot of them came from Western companies, maybe US subsidiaries. And there's actually a RAND document, and the RAND corporation's fully funded by the US government, the DoD, and all the different sectors, where they talk about all the different governments that provided weaponry and chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein. You have, East and West Germany, you have Brazil, you have France, Britain, the US. So there's lots of evidence that we did provide it. But even if we didn't, we was aware they used chemical weapons. But and even actually George H.W. Bush, all the way, I think a year or 2 years before the Gulf War, did a national security directive where he said they were still basically willing to send certain dual-use military items to Saddam Hussein, literally almost up until the point of the invasion. Again, I'll put this in the show notes.
Yeah. I mean, that war in the 80s, first of all, there's a document, and I just tried to Google it. I'm not going to be able to find it, but where you have the American administration in 1980 giving through the Saudis, telling Saddam Hussein, we are okay with you attacking Iraq.
Yeah,
right?
Alexander Haig.
Alexander Haig, that's right.
There's a document where he says, it was interesting to see that Jimmy Carter gave a green light to Saddam Hussein to attack Iran through King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. I'll put it in the show notes. That's
right. It always trips me out because Haig was a Reagan guy, and it always trips in my head because I knew it was the Carter administration that gave the green light, and I've got Haig, but also too. But then the United States really enters the war in '87 directly, and you have American naval forces and air forces engaging with the Iranians fairly regularly. And at one point, the largest naval battle since World War II was in the Persian Gulf between the American Navy and the Iranian Navy. I mean, rather small overall in the sense, but it has that metric that because there haven't been naval battles really since the World War II. But it was bigger, I think, in terms of like the number of forces involved than say the Falklands conflict. I'll have to, but if it wasn't, then it's the second biggest naval battle, right? But the idea being is that the United States was integrally involved in that war. But at some points, if people remember, you had the United States selling weapons to Iran via the Israelis. And there were battles in the Iran-Iraq war where both sides were firing American-supplied weapons at one another. So there were points where we were back. I mean, the whole thing was absolute madness. I think the people who were conducting it thought themselves as some kind of Machiavellian masterminds that were manipulating the whole thing. And, yeah, it really was. I mean, and the importance of that document that from Hague about the Iranians, the Iraqis getting the green light to attack Iran, is that in 1990, when Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government go to the Americans and say, hey, we're thinking about invading Kuwait, and April Glaspie, the ambassador American ambassador, says, we don't take any issues with that. We're not picking sides. We don't see, the United States doesn't see itself getting involved in Persian Gulf affairs. And with that experience from 11 years prior where they had gotten the green light, why wouldn't the Iraqis take that as, okay, we're getting the thumbs up to do this again? So you do all this. This matters. I mean, all this stuff matters because it helps explain how you get to this point.
Yeah, I am going to move it on, but that was actually one of my questions sort of near the end if we had time. But it's how did we basically go from backing Saddam Hussein against Iran, letting him use chemical weapons, literally, lots of agricultural companies and people like Betchel, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it ready, to get contracts with Saddam Hussein. And then there's that, you're talking about April Glaspie, she's in, there's a congressional testimonial where they're going back and forth and she's like, they're asking, do we have an alliance with Kuwait? No, like all this stuff. If they're invaded by, say, Iraq, will we do anything? No, all of this sort of stuff. So then suddenly Saddam Hussein's Hitler,
yes,
the Gulf War, that's George H.W. Bush calling Saddam Hussein Hitler, to the Gulf War, to the sanctions, to the airstrikes, to Iraq. There's a long train of thought, but maybe we can touch on some of the irony.
Yeah, but that's the American way, though. And the Americans have done that over and over again. Look, we spoke before about the Nixon administration arming the Kurds in 72 through 75. And then in the 80s, defending Iraq, at the very least, possibly helping them gas the Kurds, to then, having the no-fly zone over throughout the 90s, early 2000s, to then liberating the Kurds in 2003. I mean, just one thing after another where there is a betrayal. And this happens over and over again. And I mean, to put it in context, you hear a lot of commentators in the U.S. saying that about Ukraine. Like, it's only a matter of time before the U.S. betrays the Ukrainian people, just like we've done to, countless others.
Yeah, I was almost going to, again, there was a sit down with the Prime Minister of Iraq. What's his name? Tariz, I can't remember, but he's with Kissinger, and they're basically like, are you going to stop arming the Kurds now that, the reapproachment's happening? He's like, that's in the past, it's fine. Right. We can stop it. We're friends now. Like, it's quite funny. But anyway, to move it on, otherwise we could get caught on that. If we have time, maybe we can touch on it. But yeah, what was the Israeli role? You touched on it earlier. I actually was recently, just to sort of get obviously I was so young when this happened. I've been watching sort of stuff from the time to try and understand, the build up. And Benjamin Netanyahu, who was he was prime minister in 1996 to 1999, and he gives testimony in 2002 to the Senate or the Congress, one of the committees, basically saying why we need to use military force in Iraq. He says, if you can get UN support, great. If you can't, just do it. And he even gives the example where he says the Israelis bombed the nuclear factory in the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraq one, which I think maybe the French was assisting them with in 1981. He's like, we didn't ask for permission. We just did it because it was for our national security and our very existence. So obviously he wasn't actually prime minister then, but what was the Israeli link to this? Obviously, a lot of the neocons who are also close to the Israelis. So what was Israel's role in it? Is it exaggerated, or is it just a component of many components in this drive for a war?
It was a component of many components, but it was a primary component. You know, it was in the first row. It goes a lot. This goes a lot back to the way these men and women view the world as a game of Risk. You know, Brzezinski's grand chessboard, and the idea that you're going to move around pieces, substitute pieces, take other pieces out, and then things are going to fall into place. And so certainly the Israelis, you know, as characterized by Netanyahu, advocated for the overthrow of Saddam's government so that they could have someone, at best, maybe if not allied with them, neutral to them, and not willing to support the Palestinians, right? So you take that piece of support out, as well as they had this really confounded understanding of the Ba'ath Party structure. They saw Iraq and Syria in many ways on the same page, but they weren't. They happened to be Ba'athists, but they weren't conjoined or anything like that. As well, too, you know, again, how when you start plotting out their thoughts and start putting it as a digression, you know, this idea that removing Saddam would weaken Iran, when Saddam was the biggest hedge against Iran, this logical fallacy comes up over and over again. And it's hard to understand what they were thinking, because it doesn't take more than a couple seconds of thought to terminate that as a rational decision. But they did. They really did think by removing Iraq, by removing Saddam and his government, they would get something that would further weaken Iran. I don't, you know, maybe they thought the Saudis or the Jordanians would take a lead role there, but then that doesn't improve your situation with the Palestinians, right? So let alone, of course, what happens where, you know, Iraq gets comes under much more under sway of the Iranians to a degree. I think that's overhyped as well at times, but yeah, you know, I mean. Israel was heavily involved, though, in Iraq. So when I was in Iraq, my first year, I was based at Tikrit, but there are 4 provinces I worked in north of Baghdad. Salah Province, which is Tikrit, Diyala Province, and then Kirkuk Province, and then Sulmania Province. And Sulmania is a Kurdish province. And then we go up to Sulmania, and they've got this brand new airport they're opening. And talking to their, you know, governor and everyone else, and, you know, where'd you guys get this money from? How'd you guys build this thing? This is a new airport. And they said the Israelis gave it to us, right? And Israel saw the Kurds as a way to, you know, against Syria, against Iraq, against Iran, you know, and so the Israelis were heavily involved, as you would expect, as any, you know, nation would be, particularly when you have these nations who are led by people who do view the grand chessboard and have that type of belief that they can control things. But yeah, no, the Israelis were quite involved. And of course, with the neoconservatives in the United States, they viewed, for a host of different reasons, some of it, you know, messianic, some of it religious, this conjoinment, this alliance between Israel and the United States. I mean, there are those who believe that this is part of the historical movement of time, you know, and others were more secular in their understanding of the relationship and desire for a relationship between Israel and the United States. But there was, and that was a heavy influence on many members of the American foreign policy establishment in terms of, you know.
Could you, sorry, I was going to ask this earlier, but could you just explain what a neocon is, who the neoconservatives are, the project from New American Century, and just because even me, I hear the word neoconservative, I know, you know, the classic sort of members of it and, you know, sort of what they stood for, but like, what actually is a neoconservative? What's the difference, you know?
So neoconservatives, you know, their foundation lies in the Vietnam War, and they pick up steam, particularly, say, at the end of the 70s when the Republicans are out of power, and they are primarily Republican, but you see a lot of crossover. And in practice, there's not much of a difference between the neoconservatives, the Republican Party, and, say, the liberal interventionists of the Obama administration. There's really not much difference. And I think now you'll see in the United States, many people, particularly on the left, will just refer to that entire movement as neoconservative. So there's really no distinction between Joe Biden being a liberal interventionist or a neoconservative. So might as well call him neoconservative, because it all falls in the same rubric. And the neoconservatives are the ones that really have the organizational structure. But you had this thing called Plan B, or Team B, in the late 70s, and which was a more forceful, militaristic response to Carter's attempts at rapprochement. You also had many of these who were aghast at Ronald Reagan's arm control policies, his relationship with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, but then the end of the Cold War is what gives them kind of like their historical underpinning. This idea that America won the Cold War, this proves us right. This shows that America is the indispensable nation, that there is an American exceptionalism. This is our place. And again, whether it's secular or more religious, they exist equally. So the neoconservatives in the 90s, when they're out of power, the Clinton administration is in power, the neoconservatives start what's called the Project for a New American Century, which is a think tank, which is really profiled by one of their key documents, which argues for a forceful American presence, America making the 21st century the way it wants to be, that Americans, we have a duty, a responsibility, and a right to do so. And there's a lot of subtext to that. There are famous passages from their kind of mission statement, their purpose statement, about how the United States should remake the Middle East, that the United States should not be afraid to get into wars, that the United States should stand up to anyone who might even remotely challenges America's sole place as the world's only superpower. And certainly you see vestiges of this now with how the United States is responding to China, how the United States views anything as a threat to them, as a mortal threat. But and then there's most famously, I think people are familiar with it, it's called PNAC, Project for a New American Century. This idea that in order to let this happen, though, you would need a Pearl Harbor type event, which is the kind of the locus, or what kind of provides a lot of oomph behind a lot of the conspiracies of 9/11, was you had this PNAC document from several years before saying we need a Pearl Harbor event to justify going to war and remaking the Middle East and setting straight the world order and making sure no one could ever threaten our primacy. And then 9/11 happened. So that, I don't believe that, but I think it's just good timing. Plus the fact that Al-Qaeda was really pissed off at us, and you had this, on and on and on, plenty of reasons for them to do so, as they saw. That's kind of the project of the neoconservatives. And so when the George W. Bush administration comes into power, their ranks are flooded with neoconservatives. And people who were very influential, people like Richard Pearl, Robert Kagan, and others, have rolled in and out of government. Some of them were quasi-government, on these defense advisory boards, that was able to steer and to ensure that what they thought should happen was going to happen. And as we discussed earlier, then they launched this effort to get the war they wanted, and they got it. But their thinking is still there. And neocons really are, I think, the personification of the American exceptionalism trope that dominates American political foreign policy.
Yeah, the document you was referring to is Rebuilding America's Defenses, and it's the quote where they say, without a catalyzing event like Pearl Harbor, it would be hard to do. And they talk about, we need a lasting presence in the Gulf region, and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, we've sort of set up how the Iraq War came about, some of the influences that caused it, the ideas around it, and the administration. Let's get to your role and the actual Iraq War itself. So if you just want to tell people what you were responsible for in Iraq, and basically what you was doing there, when it first kicked off.
Sure. I probably should start in the Pentagon because the war became very personal to me very quickly. So again, I was in the Secretary of Navy's office. One of my duties, my principal duty, I think, was as a White House liaison officer, and so I dealt with the White House on behalf of the Marine Corps. And in that capacity, the second Marine that was killed in Iraq, the condolence letter from the president sent to his family was returned for a bad address. And the White House got very upset about that. And so my boss, who was the executive assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, said, "Hey, Captain Ho, you're going to call every casualty officer and make sure the address is correct from here on out." I said, "Okay." And that's what I did. And you're calling from the Secretary of Navy's office. The Commandant of the Marine Corps' office was two doors down from me. And so when you talk to these guys and you say, "Is there anything I can help you with?" and you start hearing how the Marine Corps' casualty system, the casualty notification system, the casualty handling system was completely broken, completely messed up, and just one thing after another. And so the war became very personal for me very quickly because I would end up dealing with the families of dead Marines in that first year who were going through not just the process of losing their son or their husband or their brother, but of being victimized by a bureaucracy that had no interest in seeing things done correctly, that only wanted to see itself protected and to move on from any problems, not have to change, not have to acknowledge that they're wrong. And that to me has always been one of many things that show the corrupt nature of the whole system. You have all these banners and slogans and take care of each other and a brotherhood and everything, but then when you call these colonels at the casualty, they just want to ignore it. And that was what you would see throughout the war, where people in charge, people in leadership positions just didn't want to accept any responsibility, didn't want to do anything that was going to prove difficult, didn't want to, again, very similar to journalists. They didn't want to be the ones who stick their necks out, because you stick your neck out, you get it cut off like Donahue or Hedges or Ventura. So why are you going to do that? Go along, get along. And so, but I got off, and, one of the things is that in the summer of 2003, the expectations all still were that the Marine Corps was going to leave the Iraq War in the fall and never go back. That there was not going to be a large-scale occupation, and the Marine Corps is not going to take part in any small-scale occupation. The Army would do that. They bring in peacekeepers. We build up the Iraqi security forces, whatever. And that's what the expectations were. That's what everyone was saying in the Pentagon. And in the summer of 2003, I had to make a decision what I want to do, whether I want to stay in or get out. And, and at that point I had 5.5 years in. And when you get out of the when you get out as an officer, you got to give them like 6 months notice. And, this whole story, just to prove a point about how stupid we all were. I get out because I felt like I had missed the war. I felt like the war was over and I had missed it. That there wasn't, that type of, right? That type of foolishness. At the same time, too, seeing from my perspective what was occurring, because I had friends who were in Iraq with the Marine Corps. They would occasionally be able to email back, be like, "Hey, you're in the Secretary of Navy's office. What the hell's going on over here? What are we doing?" And then, as well as I'm reading the intelligence. But then hearing what the senior leadership was saying, what the senior DoD civilians and what the generals were all saying, and then that disconnect, right? So early on in the war, it's personal for me. I see that it's just a complete sham that any bureaucracy is ever going to care for the people in it. The institution is going to do what's best to protect itself. And I see that the senior leadership is going to lie about this, right, regardless of what's happening there. And then, of course, you're starting to realize that it all was lies, right? The whole thing was one big lie. It's coming, so I get it. So I put in to get off active duty. That would have been April of 2004. And at that point, a friend of mine who was in the Pentagon with me as a naval officer had been detailed down to the Coalition Provisional to the CPA, which was the colonial administration under Paul Bremer that the United States used to control Iraq and to govern Iraq in its first year or so. And he said to me, we've got these DoD civilian positions that we need to put onto the State Department's team in Iraq. Would you be interested in that? And this was reconstruction work. I was assigned to the Ministry of Youth and Sport, and I was supposed to go there and manage a reconstruction program to help rebuild, soccer or football fields, youth centers, stadiums, what have you, community centers. And so I got to Baghdad on the tail end of CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority. I was blanking on what A stood for. It was part of CPA for 6 weeks before it turned over to the U.S. Embassy. And Iraq was giving its sovereignty. And people who are listening, I just use the air quotes for sovereignty, of course. And with that, I get there end of April, and it's clear that there is a very serious resistance, that there's an organized insurgency. He'd had the first battle of Fallujah, he'd had battles in Najaf, battles in Samarra, very serious events, as well as everything else, indicating that there is an organized resistance here. And you're also starting to see the Al-Qaeda elements come in as well, right? So I get we could do a whole show on just what a catastrophe the CPA was, what a joke it was. You couldn't have gotten together a more unprofessional, unserious, incompetent group of hacks to run a war than what you had at CPA. It really was amazing. This is why I'll say that the best books to read about war are things like Catch-22 or MASH, because only in satire can you capture the reality of it. It was just stupefying. But I was there for 4 weeks or so, maybe a little less, when I was told, hey, this $20 million project you have to go do your soccer fields and whatever, that is ending. We are giving that money directly to the ministries. We have a security problem here and everything else. And I said, okay. And also too, we're turning over. It's their sovereignty. It's their money. The money we were using was what's called the DFI money, Development Fund for Iraq. So this was the oil for food money. This was the frozen reserves, overseas reserves of the Iraqi government, plus whatever we gotten our hands on when we got in there. And this belongs to the people of Iraq. And so within a day, that money had been transferred to the Iraqis. Now, the key thing, $20 million in cash, all out of the Federal Reserve System, all $100 bills, serialized, vacuum sealed, just like you see in the movies. The thing about that, though, is that the way it was done was at that point, the Iraqi government, the ministries have been divided up between various Iraqi, groups. And the group that was in charge of the Ministry of Youth and Sport, and they had some other ministries as well, was called SCIRI, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. And they have been based out of Tehran and Iran for decades. People are probably most familiar with them because their militia was called the Badr Corps. So very effective in the coming civil war. That $20 million was just taken and given directly to SCIRI in cash. And $20 million, of course, you can imagine, buys a lot of Kalashnikovs, buys a lot of RPKs and RPGs and other types of weapons. I saw that right away. Now, as well, to the corruption that was there, because the Americans that were involved in that were on the take. And when I went to the CPA Inspector General to report this, because the whole thing was dirty, I was told we're leaving in a couple weeks. We can't do anything about it. We're disbanding. There won't be anyone to do anything about it. You've got to go to the State Department and their IG. So I went to the State Department IG, and the State Department IG says, well, we're not in charge here, and we won't have any authority over anything that was before us, right? I mean, these guys, these Americans, had done the same thing in the Balkans years before, right? This was a whole racket. This whole war was a racket like all the other wars were. So, I mean, I elaborate on that just to kind of give the setup to what this was all like, and so what happens then is the State Department, the embassy, moves me up to Crete and I run a reconstruction program up there for a year, basically, and all done in cash. I'm also involved with the big American reconstruction efforts that are billions of dollars, and I'm also very involved politically in those provinces up there because I've got millions of dollars. I got tens of millions of dollars, and I'm involved with the billions of dollars, and so I'm an important guy. So here I am, this 31-year-old who, doesn't speak Arabic, let alone knows anything about anything of what he's doing, in charge of all of this stuff, in charge of this reconstruction effort in 4 provinces of Iraq. And there's supposed to be a team of like 15 of us. Eventually, one other guy shows up. So the whole thing was just ludicrous. And it was all based then on the tenets of counterinsurgency, and we're all reading Lawrence of Arabia and everything else. None of us reading after the First War, when Lawrence, of course, denounces everything that was done, decries it, right? Has a crisis over it. Goes to his death. I think he probably killed himself on that motorcycle. Goes to his death bemoaning his role in what the Brits did to the Arab peoples. All we know is the David Lean film, right? With Peter O'Toole and reading, Seven Pillars and everything else, right? Didn't read the second half. But this idea that we were going to use counterinsurgency principles to connect the people to the government, et cetera, complete nonsense, complete, if anything was counterproductive. The more you have a foreign presence, the more you're going to have resistance to it. And we did things, I saw things like we would pay out every week anywhere from maybe say $50,000 or $60,000 to over $2 million in cash to the Iraqis who were doing the work for us, paving roads, putting in sewer lines, building schools, all that stuff. At one point, I had 3,000 Iraqis working for me. And at the same time, you're putting in all this money. We've got entire infantry brigades in this province. We're bringing in, thousands of Shia and Kurdish forces to staff and man the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army, which takes over from the Iraqi National Guard, all that, and all you see with this massive force and all this money is just the insurgency, the resistance continue to blossom. Every week it gets stronger. Every week it gets bigger. Every week it gets more effective. Every week it has more popular support. So by the time I leave in May of 2005, this is a mistake. We got to get out of this place. This is not going to, right? And you come home. I remember one of the first things coming home was hearing Dick Cheney on Meet the Press or one of those Sunday morning talk shows talking about how we are witnessing the death throes of the insurgency in Iraq, right? Again, just the lies, the constant lies. I end up and lying to myself all this time too, lying to myself, not having the courage to walk away from it, thinking that I can be my own agent in the midst of all this immorality, that somehow my agency is going to matter, that the war is not going to overpower that and use me as its agent. And also too, you tell yourself things like, well, I'm like at best a mid-level guy. When I get to be a senior guy, I won't do this stuff. I'm going to stick through this. And so when it's my turn at the top, I won't let this happen, and then, so I end up going to the Iraq, the State Department, on the Iraq desk, work on the Iraq desk for 5-6 months before I get an email, because I was still in the reserve of the Marine Corps, get an email to mobilize as a company commander and take a company of Marines over to Iraq. And, at that point you're I've just spent now 6 months or however long at the State Department. I used to lie about this all the time because one of my jobs was to write up the Iraq Weekly Status Report. And this was a report. It went to the president, went to the vice president. I know the Secretary of State read it every week. And then it went to thousands of people. There was a classified and an unclassified version. Went to thousands of people, media. And this was, 25 to 30 pages of PowerPoint type thing, telling the good news in Iraq, the weekly status report, how things are getting better. And I would spend my week trying to figure out ways to show that the war is getting better, right? So, and then dealing with the whole interagency, the nonsense, the people who had no idea where Iraq was on a map, and you could interchange Iraq with Venezuela, with Iran, with whoever, and they wouldn't care. All they had was that bloodlust to do this war. Yeah, and then the incompetence of the whole system. I mean, all of that. But all my other arguments for continuing with this are completely flushed. So when I get asked to mobilize, I then it becomes, well, I'm a pretty good officer, and if I don't do this, some other guy's going to take these kids over there and he's going to get them killed. So then it becomes about taking care of others, right? And so you just continue to lie, you continue to rationalize. So I do. I take a company of Marines over to Anbar Province, get there in 2006. Very violent, very difficult time. Was there for the surge, for the Anbar awakening, for the Sons of Iraq. Saw how that all occurred. Had absolutely nothing to do with the prowess or the tactical or operational skills of the U.S. military. Had nothing to do at all with General Petraeus' genius. In fact, through some act of God, it didn't get worse with Petraeus in charge. I don't know how, because he's, but what it was simply was the fact that we answered the grievances of the Sunni people. We gave them back their cities and villages. We cut them back into the government. We pulled the Shia and Kurdish forces out. We pulled our troops back. We let them govern their areas. And, you saw all that and came home again and was done with it. And then, but was going through really difficult times, very suicidal, trying to drink myself to death. And because I worked with the State Department so much, opportunity came to be appointed as a political officer and go to Afghanistan. And there was still some of me that believed, okay, maybe I can go in Afghanistan and do what we did in Iraq, answer the grievances of the insurgency, bring about some type of, right, have that kind of work. But, as well, too, this notion that, well, it's better to die over there than kill myself here. So maybe I'll go to Afghanistan and get killed. So that was kind of the whole process. And then, I was 5 months into the war in Afghanistan when I resigned from that in protest because the escalation of the war in 2009, seeing exactly where it was going to go, seeing exactly where that was going to go if we did not, because we were choosing to win militarily, just as we had chosen to done in Iraq for years, and that had done nothing but further the resistance, deepen the war, kill more people, and we should have gotten out. But that's kind of the long and short of my time doing all that.
Well, you laid it out very well there. I would like to get to the Sunni-shia violence and, the actual kind of war itself and some of the fighting that went. But just before that, so you obviously touched on it a bit there, but what was, when you became a Marine Corps company commander, what was the mood of your Marines with you? What was the mood of the population, the locals, anyone you spoke to? In our previous interview that we did about Afghanistan, obviously you just mentioned your time as a political officer. I remember you saying, as soon as you got to Iraq, you knew it was, a criminal sort of enterprise. What was the general mood of the population? Did they ever see us as liberators? Was there someone who generally thought this could be a good thing that pretty quickly after the shock and awe campaign disappeared? And
the Kurds certainly did. The Kurds certainly did. And this is why this is one of those things where nothing is ever easy. The Kurds certainly did. You go to the Kurdish parts of the country and they would thank you. I go up to Sunni-shia and you drive up through Kirkuk, and it'd be very dangerous. And then you pass over the river and get into the Kurdish part of Kirkuk, and things would be a little bit different. And then you get to a point where you kind of officially entered Kurdish territory. There is kind of a mountain, a chain of hills that you pass through, and at that point, we took our helmets off and we didn't man the guns and everything else. And you were in Kurdistan, and you in Sunni-shia, which is a nice little city, beautiful. We went to restaurants. We sat in the sidewalks and drank coffee. We were in a hotel where you didn't have guys standing guard or anything like that. And remember, I was a civilian DoD official, and I had private security at a company called Aegis as my security. And these are British company. Most of my guys are Brits, a couple Americans, one or two Irish, some Scots, South African, a German, But yeah, you go up there and they would not. None of us would have body armor on. They would keep their sidearms. but they didn't take their rifles with them, and we walked and we went shopping and everything else. And people would come up to you and they would say, "Thank you for liberating us," very sincerely. I remember having one exchange where, and it was so interesting there. I mean, we could do a whole thing is what that was like, Kurdistan, the smuggling that was going on and everything else. But one day I'm standing there and these two Kurdish guys come up and they say, they introduce themselves and we're talking, and only one of them speaking English, but he said, "This is my cousin or someone, and he's from Iran. He says you need to come and do Iran next." My thoughts were like, "Good Christ, are you serious? You don't want that." But for the Kurds, it was a liberation. I mean, and this is something that makes it all so complicated. But I was never in the Shia-held area, in the Shia areas, the south of Iraq. I was always in Sunni areas and in Baghdad. And it was a nightmare for those people. And as a Iraqi, I worked with a Sunni. I worked with from Salah. I remember talking about this. He said, "No one ever wants to be occupied," and I still don't. And he was my friend, and he was the person I worked with the most. He was kind of like my right-hand guy, and I have no idea whatever happened to him. I believe the Islamic State killed him in 2014. But no way of finding out, right? I mean, you try, but the I have no idea if during our time in 04 and 05 when we worked together, what his connection to the resistance was, insurgency was. There must have been some. Whether he was just kicking back money to them or he was more thoroughly involved, I don't know. But, it was so many of those in the Sunni areas were trying, I think, to thread a needle between pleasing the occupation and making it less worse than it could be, and supporting their own resistance, supporting the nationalist and local sentiments that were very legitimate to opposing the occupation.
Can we?
Yeah.
Sorry, just before we carry on, I think we should clarify. It was going to be my next question, but we're sort of here already. Can you just explain who was the government we were backing? What is, the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia? Obviously, Iraq was more of a Shia population where,
Right.
The Gulf monarchies, Jordan, Turkey, they're all Sunni Muslims, sort of like, Christian Protestants, or
Right.
versions of Muslims. And Saddam Hussein sort of held it down because he was like a secular government. Obviously, that changed after we overthrew him in 2003. So, could you just explain who was the government we was backing, and how does this play into the Sunni-Shia violence?
Right. At a national level, at the Baghdad level, the Iraqi government that we had put into power was nothing more, for the most part, than expatriates who were grifters, corrupt, profiteers, liars. Ahmad Chalabi, most famous among them. I'm talking about the first couple years. So what was it? The Iraqi National Congress, Iraqi National, whatever, who we put into power to begin with, were people who had been professional expatriates opposing the Saddam regime for years. Many of them had foreign support, such as the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was based out of Iran and had Iran's full support. Others were just grifters who were individuals who had gotten to know the American masterminds behind the war and were key to influencing them. A lot of this false intelligence comes from them, right? Whether it is about the introduction to various Iraqi agents who give this information, whether it's them themselves saying that Iraq has various weapons or they've done this or that, or just setting the scene of that every Iraqi government building has a torture station in it or some nonsense like that, right? I mean, so they were very influential, and these are the people that populate the senior levels of government. The Iraq was not a sectarian nation before our invasion. You talk to Iraqis to your blue in your face, you'll have a hard time finding one who will claim it was a sectarian nation. Certainly, there were Shia, there were Kurds, there were Sunnis. There were a host of other minority groups as well. But there was no delineation in the society, and they intermarried. They lived in neighborhoods together. It was certainly not the structured hierarchy of ethnicities or sects that the Americans believed it was. And so when the de-Baathification occurs by the American government in the first year of the occupation, where which takes its lead from the denazification of Germany post World War II. But this idea is that if you were Sunni, you're automatically Ba'ath Party. If you're Ba'ath Party, you're automatically a Nazi. Basically, just to kind of simplify it. That just was not how the structure worked. And certainly the Sunnis were at the top, but there were plenty of Shia, there were Kurds, there were many people from different groups who were represented in Saddam's government and in the Ba'ath Party. Saddam held it all together in a way that, say, Tito did in Yugoslavia. You know, he understood how to use leverage. He understood how to use carrots and sticks. And so I think if there was anything that you could point to and say, look, there was a hierarchy, I think it was, this is my estimation of it, and people may disagree and point me to be wrong, but that it was a tribal hierarchy, and that some tribes were more favored than others, and some tribes got more than others, and some tribes were on the outs. Also, too, certain towns and cities were more favorable to the regime than others. Fallujah and Samara were two towns that were that Saddam and the Ba'ath Party always had trouble controlling. If you went to Samara, like I did many times, there was kind of an access, a bypass to it. Most of the other highways, when you went through the cities, the highway would go right through the middle of the city. In Samara, you bypassed it, and you talk to the Iraqis. And they'd be like, well, that town's always a problem, you know, and, you know, Saddam never could control it, you know, they tell you. So it wasn't all harmony. It wasn't, you know, a land of just where everyone got along well. There was a power brokering. There were carrot and sticks used. There was force used. Some groups, and again, I see as more tribal, were elevated than others. And then, of course, you had movements. I'm not denying that there wasn't an issue between the Kurds in Baghdad, the Kurds and Baghdad, or the Shia in the south and Baghdad. But that was not what was representative in the general population. And so if you're in a city like Baghdad, which was a mixed city, those differences didn't apply. And certainly the Iraqis I worked with my first year there, because I worked with primarily Iraqis, you know, they tell you these things. They intermarried, but the Americans came in, again, like we talked before, divide and conquer strategy. They saw the ethnicities or the sects as the way the country was ruled, which was incorrect. I mean, these you know, men like Paul Wolfowitz, who was the second in command of the Defense Department under Don Rumsfeld, and who this really, a lot of the de-Baathification policies and the way the Americans set out to rule Iraq at 2003 onward comes from Wolfowitz. You know, his understanding of the country was just completely incorrect. So the United States military, they've been doing this. I don't know if they did it in World War I, but they did it in World War II, and they've always done it. Whenever they send their soldiers abroad, you get these little guidebooks that are supposed to help you understand the local culture and, you know, do's and don'ts and a little bit of history and everything else. And, you know, of course, from my understanding is in World War II, these were actual books. Now, of course, it's like a brochure they gave you. And one day I had it lying out, and my friend I was just talking about, Anbar, saw it, picked it up, and he was laughing. And then he just said, you know what? I understand it. I understand how screwed up you guys are and how badly you've done this, because this tells me you don't know anything about Iraq. And it's absolutely the case. We didn't know anything about Iraq. We didn't know anything about anything. I mean, and let alone how the government actually functioned, and the notion of how, say, the government worked on a day-to-day basis, how it worked through its ministries, and how then you had ministries at the provincial level, at the government level. I mean, we had no conception of any of that, and just but we had this hubris that told us we did, or that it didn't, or maybe they these people just felt it didn't matter that they didn't know.
Could you talk about the torture that went on? Did you witness any yourself? Did you hear about? Or if not, can you just, give people sort of the background of sort of the torture that went on, the extraordinary renditioning, and just sort of the background of them elements, or any personal experience you have, if not just the background?
Yeah, I didn't witness it directly, other than the fact that you puck people, put under custody, and so I saw plenty of Iraqi mams, as they were called, military-aged males, with their hands bound, zip tied behind them, and hoods over their heads. That was my extent with that directly. However, as you get through that first year, and as the Civil War really begins, which is a civil war completely of the Americans' making, you start hearing these stories, and you start seeing, both in the press as well as in the intelligence, about people being dumped in streets, people being found with obvious torture wounds, and you start to see this sectarian aspect to it. Again, that's great, because I should qualify. It's not like Iraq was a place of complete harmony, and there weren't people who saw things, the Iraqis who saw things through sectarian lenses, and who felt that they could use their sect against others and have an advantage, and they wanted primacy and everything else. And there certainly is a case made that the Sunnis were the prime group in Iraq, and certainly they were in many ways, but it wasn't that simple, is what I'm saying. But so you start seeing this civil war, basically, and you start seeing the torture wounds, and you put it together. Okay, well, we all this notions of sovereignty, and all the Iraqis then belong to the Iraqi police, or they're handed. I mean, and then you start to see what's happening extra government. So that a lot of these people are being turned over to police. Well, who's filling the police? Well, it's these Shia militias that have filled the police. This is General David Petraeus's brainchild. I didn't know much about John Negroponte when he took over as ambassador in 2004 for the U.S. government. Negroponte had a long history at the U.S. State Department. He was the first, also after this, he was the first director of national intelligence. Negroponte was involved very heavily in the Central America in the 80s, in particular with the death squads. He runs current. And the idea that we started seeing death squads in Iraq at the same time that John Negroponte shows up to take over the State Department and the CIA by extension, then, right? There's no denying that. So you understand. I mean, because I remember when we showed up, and I didn't know the guy really, and somebody did, and said, "Jesus, you know who that guy is?" And I said, "I don't know." And so, read up, and I'm like, "Oh man, this guy, has got a colorful career." I mean, but that type of you're seeing all these pieces starting to fit together, right? And then you're seeing the fruits of the de-Baathification, where these Shia groups are given control. You see the connection between the militias and the military. You have David Petraeus take over what's called McSticky, the training command. McSticky is an acronym which is escaping me right now. Security and Training of Iraq, Multinational Core Security Training of Iraq. So McSticky, and among other things, besides losing hundreds of thousands of weapons. When Petraeus is in charge of this training command, they lose hundreds of thousands of rifles and pistols, right? They didn't lose them, they gave them away. But it's claimed as lost, and everyone says, okay, and Petraeus gets promoted and becomes, But, during this time, too, you have this relationship between the Iraqi police and the militias, the civil war, You're seeing the torture. The Sunnis, of course, start fighting back. The Sunnis, this is when you really start to see that connection between the Sunni resistance and the foreign fighter Al-Qaeda element, which, becomes, this is their lifeline. This is who they can depend upon. This is the only people they have supporting them, which is broken in '06 in the Anbar awakening, the Sunni awakening, because what happens is, to jump to there, to go back to that, the surge and the success of that, or whatnot, is what happens is when we address the Sunni grievances and they said, we want our lands back, we want to be in control of our villages and cities, take these Shia and Kurd forces out, give us our land back, and we do, they right away turn on Al-Qaeda in a heartbeat. That's how Al-Qaeda in Iraq is decimated in the fall and late '06, just because the Sunnis say those guys are over in that building. And that's it. We send in a recon team, SEALs come in, Delta comes in, whoever, we drop a JDAM on the building, whatever we did, and roll up Al-Qaeda in Iraq throughout Anbar and then up through the Tigris River Valley through that process. But that's who they helped. That were the only people they had to help them, right? So when you took away that, but you see the formation of that, all of this happening, and behind it all is the torture that we know about. WikiLeaks, of course, we know through much of this, but thousands of Iraqis being killed every month in this violence that didn't exist before we got there, violence that was a reality of our creation, and violence that very much had underneath it these torture, where they were torturing one another as a form of revenge, often ways, but also too as a form of intimidation and as a form of trying to. What you see happen in Baghdad before the United States gets there and invades and occupies, Baghdad is a mixed city. There are neighborhoods that are more Shia than Sunni and vice versa, right? But certainly, Sadr City being the best example. But the for the most part, it's a mixed city. And then what you see happening is in really '04, '05, '06, is the city really breaks along sectarian lines. People flee their mixed neighborhoods for the safety of the sectarian neighborhoods. Because, Louis, you may be Shia, I might be Sunni. We may have lived next to each other our whole lives. Our wives are best friends. My daughter married your son, kind of thing. But I can't trust your cousins. And that's that in how quickly it devolves. And so by the time I leave in spring of '05, this is fully going on, and the Iraqis are just astounded. They don't know what to say about this and how quickly it happened. And it's very similar that how that devolved so fast, like a whirlpool, how it devolved so fast, how it was so quick and just escalated and reinforced itself, I think is very similar to what you hear people from the Balkans say about what happens in the '90s, how quick it happened. How once it started, it was unstoppable. And the horror of that, and best exemplified by the torture that the American government knew full well was going on. As WikiLeaks showed, we were handing over prisoners, detainees, as we called them, to Iraqi forces that were going to torture those people. We knew that. We knew they were going to execute them, hand them over anyway.
Yeah, so you touched on, well, obviously the violence that broke out, soon after we invaded, occupied, civil war. What else happened? Obviously, what we can see now, and obviously there's the influence of the Syrian civil war, was the growth of ISIS. So I know we haven't loads of time left, but can you just talk about that? Obviously, the prisons, they were all sort of mixing around with each other. There's quite a lot of articles around it. I remember reading one where they're saying they're writing each other's names and phone numbers on their waistband and their pants, for when they get out, things like that. Lots of. So when I think it's Paul Bremer, as you said, when he comes in, they get rid of all the Baathists, all these people who, are quite militant, with Saddam Hussein. So they just fire all these people and just expect them to just, go off farming for the rest of their life. That's talked about how they end up sort of working with ISIS down the years, not because of the ideology, just because That's what they've been doing a long time. They like the power, they're into it.
Yeah,
So
they were as a good partnership. Yeah. Yeah, well, and
yes,
Paul Bremer, I mean, people talk a lot about Paul Bremer disbanding the Iraqi military, which had a huge effect. It really did. People give it too much credence, as if Bremer hadn't done that, things would have worked out. No, it was never going to work out. But but disbanding the Iraqi army certainly didn't help. You made hundreds of thousands of men unemployed. You humiliated a military leadership that was already humiliated by a loss, and you never gave them the opportunity to surrender. I think if that could have had an effect. If you had given the Iraqi generals an opportunity to surrender formally, say, you fought a good fight, let's shake hands, you're our partners in this now, really stick to just the whole notion that we were coming rid to get a dictator, and then gotten the hell out of there, maybe things would have been different. I don't think so, but maybe, and I don't know. But certainly by disbanding the army, by humiliating the army's leadership like that, you now had hundreds of thousands of young men and middle-aged men who went home with their weapons, of course, and now didn't have any money. Right? I mean, as well as you just humiliated them. You occupied their country. You did all types of violence to them. Every Iraqi family has a story of the violence done to them, of the aunt or the cousin or the nephew or the brother or what have you that was killed by an American bomb or American gunfire, or just even the fact that you have these checkpoints and you have young American men frisking your sister. It's had nothing to do with Islam. It's got to do with foreign troops were frisking my female family members. If you do that anywhere in the world, you're going to get the same result. So you had all of that. But what you have then is the insurgency that forms in the 2003. I believe this is one of the things that Rumsfeld was correct in his pronouncements when he called them dead enders in the first few months of the occupation. So spring of 03, summer of 03. Those were where I think the Ba'ath Party leadership that was somewhat organized still and somewhat fighting. But as the occupation goes and as the horrendous nature of it, the humiliation of it, the violence of it expands, as you have all the other aspects of it, as the Sunnis, as de-Baathification occurs, de-Sunnification occurs, as these legitimate grievances just keep not just forming but growing, you have a much more organized insurgency. Resistance. I've been trying to be better about saying resistance rather than insurgency. But what you have is, if we go back to Al-Qaeda itself. If you go back and you look at how big Al-Qaeda was in the at the time of 9/11, you're talking about 200 to 400 people total worldwide. The American invasion of Afghanistan gives Al-Qaeda a degree of legitimacy, validates their claims, basically. I don't agree with that, but that's what many people saw. The invasion of Iraq supersizes that. And so what you then have is Al-Qaeda's narrative about defending the Muslim people against the West, taking it just in the immediate or their grand historical sense of that this is an extension of the Crusades and everything else, as well, along with their kind of apocalyptic predictions about Khorasan and everything else. That has a lot of sway. But what it is, what you see happening, and I was in the State Department in 2005 and reading the intelligence reports coming from our interrogation, because these primarily young men would come from North Africa, they come from Saudi Arabia, they come from Yemen, they would come to fight the Americans in Iraq, and we'd capture some sometimes, and why are you doing this? And well, I'm coming to defend against the American invasion. I'm coming to help the Iraqi people defeat the occupation. I have witnessed what you have done, and I'm going to stand up against it. And then, of course, the photos from Abu Ghraib, what was going on at Guantanamo Bay, all those things. This gave a purpose to Al Qaeda's recruitment that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So you had this resistance in Iraq that then had this outside, and the numbers coming from the outside were never large. I mean, the estimates were that at the height of the Sunni insurgency in '06, say, 3% of the Sunni insurgency was Al Qaeda, right? 3%. And that might have been overstated. So most of the Sunni resistance was nationalist, was against the occupation, was local men who were fighting us because we were occupying them. With the support of their families and their communities. So, I mean, what you find then, as you're pointing out, is as we detain all these people, we start putting them in the prison together. Camp Bucca is the most famous one, where for years you had these Sunni nationalist insurgents, resistance fighters, some of them very senior leaders from the Iraqi army, or maybe they were tribal leaders, or they had a degree of leadership and prominence to them that gave them authority. And then they were mixed in with these jihadists, for lack of a better term. And that begins this alliance. It had begun kind of practically before, just in the sake of they're occupying the same space. However, what you see, to your point about how it gets to the point of the Syrian civil war, is this is where they really meld. This is where they really meld. What the jihadists, these external actors, bring in is they bring in a lot of money. They bring in a lot of money from the Gulf. Just like in Afghanistan, where we saw the Gulf monarchies being the chief sponsor of the Taliban for all those years, right? The Gulf monarchies, the Saudis at the top, are the chief sponsors of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And so they come in with a lot of money, because later in '06, '07, as we were rolling them up and destroying Al Qaeda in Iraq, their cells were handfuls of guys. In Anbar, there might be 5 or 6 Al Qaeda members in the whole city. That was it. But they had the money. They had the willingness. They were brutal. They certainly were not, and unlike the Sunni resistance the Iraqi Sunni resistance that you could negotiate with, and clearly saw that, you could never have negotiated with those guys. But they were so small that once the Sunnis that said we don't need you any longer, they were done, and it was easy enough to kill them off. But what they brought was money, and they brought a degree of ruthlessness that was really, really quite astounding. I mean, the things that they would do to anyone that they felt betrayed them on the Iraqi side was just absolutely awful. I mean, the whole thing was so hellish. And we haven't even gotten into the Shia aspects of this, which was just as equally complex and hellish. And I've got a friend of mine. He was a army officer who was in Sadr City in '03. And Muqtada al-Sadr, whose father had been a preeminent Shia cleric, not as big as as Sistani and Najaf, but a very, very big deal. Saddam had killed him many years before because he was threatened by him. His son, Muqtada al-Sadr, people probably familiar with that name. My friend Terrell tells me, one day he's in his company office in Sadr City, and here's this cleric just sitting there that everyone's ignoring and trying to get like an audience with the company commander or whoever. And he's basically kind of kicked out, and then everything else, and he's ignored. And this guy came back again. And this is in the first couple months of the war. It turns out this guy's a big deal. Nobody knows, right? I mean, like that, the whole, the how stupid this all was in so many levels. Right, the fact that the American units that were occupying Sadr City didn't even know who Sadr was, and when he tried to come in and talk to them, they kicked him out as some type of nuisance. They probably didn't have any translator. They probably had no one with them who spoke Arabic, even though you met plenty of Iraqis who spoke English. I mean, so the whole thing was just absolutely madness. It was just madness and stupid. But that violence was just so horrific. And it just, in a way that, the old biblical say, violence begets violence. I mean, it's true. It extrapolates, it reinforces. and where it goes is completely uncontrollable and unknowable. And so, I mean, you have this horror show in Iraq that stretches back, as we were saying, to the 70s. That's still going until now. Now, every month, dozens of Iraqis, not talking about Iraqi police or Iraqi army or the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or ISIS or anyone like that, but dozens of Iraqis, civilians, families are killed every month in political violence still in Iraq. And of course, the way that their children are dying because our war poisoned their water and their land, the number of stillbirths, the number of just deformities that the child cannot live or lives a life that is just so awful, occurring daily to countless. The estimates I heard recently were 1 in 5 children are born either stillborn or with some type of deformity in parts of Iraq. We do know that Fallujah has higher cancer rates than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that the incidence of childhood cancer in Iraq are 12 or 14 times higher than what they should be. I mean, just the brutality and the horror that the Iraqi people continue to endure, it's unknowable. It really is, in the sense of like, we cannot pretend to understand what that is for them.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even really fully gone into the full destruction of the country, the shock and awe campaign, what that actually was, and sort of the military strategy behind it, and as you said, like Fallujah and all of that. But I am going to have to finish off because I actually didn't jump off myself, and you've given me over an hour and a half. I'll just finish up with this question because I do actually have to shoot. What lessons can we learn from Iraq, and have we learned any lessons, or is it playing out again in different arenas around the world?
I think it's the age-old lessons about the corruption of authority. As I just said, violence begets violence. War is an uncontrollable force. I think the lessons are age-old. These are the lessons that you had in Rome. You had Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus with a triumvirate, right? And Crassus, he tries to take the he tries to take the Syrians, the Parthians, and his story is of he was the one that, if people remember in Game of Thrones when Khal Drogo pours the gold down Cersei's brother's throat, people remember that famous scene from that television show. That's based on the story of Crassus, who tried to conquer Syria, modern day Syria and Iraq, and for his efforts, he was so greedy, they poured molten gold down his throat. I mean, it's those stories that we have that are still true today. The aspects of hubris, aspects of authority, aspects of corruption, and the uncontrollable nature of war. That it is a breeding ground of unintended consequences. And then you mix that with the greed, with the paranoia, because so much we could have touched on in terms of the Bush administration's decision to do this. Didn't even really get into the whole domestic political angle and how a lot of this has to do with Karl Rove, who was George W. Bush's primary political advisor, seeing the Iraq War as a way to ensure a second term for Bush, because Americans reelect wartime presidents, and the data that exists for all of that, that supports that. And then, of course, the data we have, though, about how politically costly this was for the Republicans, and how it also appears to have been politically costly, the Iraq War, for Hillary Clinton in 2016. This is how the United States gets its first black president, because he is an anti-war candidate. He's not really an anti-war. He's not an anti-war president by any means, but he defeats Hillary Clinton for the Democratic Party nomination because he was against Iraq. She was for it. He defeats John McCain. Had a lot to do with Iraq, But and then 2016, there's some good evidence out there, studies by people at University of Minnesota and by Harvard, showing that anti-war sentiment in casualties, Iraq anti-war sentiment, in casualties throughout the United States in counties that had this disproportionate number of casualties, gives the election to Donald Trump, right? I mean, this is not something we're just making up. What this did. So all of this, the fact that you had electoral consequences for the Iraq War in 2016 that gives us Donald Trump, right? Is that when we talk about unintended consequences? My God, right? And again, I don't want to center the Americans here, but compared to what occurred to the Iraqis and all throughout, we didn't touch on at all what happens in Iraq post 2011. From 2014 to 2017, the American Air Force and the American Navy destroy every city in Western and Northern Iraq, just level all of them, all that stuff. So, the lessons I think are age old ones that unfortunately I think are will be repeated until we destroy ourselves.
Well, thanks for coming on, Matt. I mean, again, you could do a whole other show. I mean, you could talk for hours, obviously, about this subject. But again, I'd like to thank you for coming on the third time. I encourage people to check out our previous interviews on Afghanistan and Russia and Ukraine. Just before we go, do you want to just tell people where to find you? I will put it in the show notes and the links from before, but just, for people who are just going to listen to this.
Yeah, sure. So I work with the Eisenhower Media Network. If people want to go to our website, check that out. You can follow me on Twitter, Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H. Those two places are the best ways to find me. I've also got a Substack now where I converted over my old blog to a Substack because that's what everyone's doing. Mm-hmm. It's like MatthewHoh.substack.something. I don't know.
I'll put it in the show notes. I recently saw you post it on Twitter and signed up for it myself. But again, I really do have to go. But thank you for coming on, Matt. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to speak soon.
Thanks, Louis. I appreciate it, man. You have a good night.